My name is Oliver Heydorn, and this is my Australian mate Michael Watson. Together, we are flying from Brisbane to Hamilton to present papers at the 2018 North American Basic Income Guarantee Conference. There will be 4 people on our panel. En route, we will be joined by another Aussie, Charles or Chas Pinwell. A second Canadian, Robert Klink, will be driving down from Quebec and will be meeting us at the conference. Our purpose? To point out that something akin to a universal basic income could easily be funded through monetary reform. We'll call it a national dividend.
Tous les airs d'Alfama ne parlent que de toi, de notre histoire à la dérive, de l'aube à la nuit, je chasse l'ennui. Lisbonne sans toi croule sous mes pas. Si le temps est voleur, mon cœur en sera la prison.
All right, so here we are, Michael, in the Brisbane airport, and we're getting ready to fly to Canada. And you've got your boarding pass there, right? So we can show the boarding pass. We're going from Brisbane to Vancouver and then from Vancouver on to Toronto. Why are we going to Canada?
Well, Oliver, we will be going to the province of Ontario to attend the North American Basic Income Conference in your hometown of Hamilton.
That's right.
Yeah. And we will both be giving presentations on social credit to provide an alternative to the basic income scheme.
So we're talking about the National Dividend.
That's right, the National Dividend, which will be the money for that that will be distributed with that will be created and issued as the community's credit rather than the basic income idea where the money provided for the basic income is collected from taxation from the working citizens or is borrowed from the private banks at great interest.
All right, well, that's a short little introduction, and we'll pick it up on the other side.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yep.
The concept of a universal basic income has been in the news recently. A few jurisdictions, such as Finland and the Canadian province of Ontario, have introduced pilot projects. Switzerland held a referendum. Books and articles have been written and conferences held. The idea is that everyone, whether employed or not, should receive a monthly payment from the government to at least meet their basic living costs. There would be no means testing, no reporting. Many people from both sides of the conventional political spectrum, both on the left and on the right, have supported the proposal. In theory, it would eliminate poverty and provide everyone with a basic degree of economic security. After arriving in Vancouver, we met up with Chas.
How are you?
Oh, man.
You're here?
That's
All right.
just-
That's good to know. That's all
How's
right.
the flight?
Pretty good. Yeah, long and arduous, but yeah, we got here without
Yeah,
crashing.
I thought it was okay, really.
Yes.
Our next stop
Okay.
will be
I had
Toronto.
more leg room than I expected.
So what is preventing a universal basic income from coming into existence? Well, the big obstacle is the one that plagues our societies perennially. It is the problem of finance. Where is the money to come from? While a universal basic income would cost quite a bit of money, it would also save money, because it would largely replace existing social programs like welfare, employment insurance, and even possibly old age pensions. Eliminate those programs, and you would also eliminate the government agencies and bureaucracies needed to deliver and monitor them. Even so, many people question whether the economy can financially support a full-fledged basic income program. But there is an even bigger problem looming on the horizon: automation. To cite just one example, it has been predicted that 50% of American jobs could be automated within 20 years. 50%. The fourth industrial revolution is upon us. Intelligent machines, computers, robots, etc., in conjunction with the modern means of telecommunications, are now in a position to replace workers by brain just as thoroughly as older machines replaced workers by brawn in agriculture and textiles decades ago. While a universal basic income would be a godsend, providing income to those who cannot find employment in the new automated economy, the automation of jobs will also make it more difficult to fund a UBI through conventional financial means. Let's say that the UBI is funded entirely through taxation. As the pool of workers shrinks and the pool of the permanently unemployed grows, the taxes which will have to be levied on the remaining workers will have to increase accordingly. Even if you could tax the remaining workers sufficiently to provide a UBI, which is highly unlikely, the fact that the workers would be losing a large and increasing portion of their salaries to support the non-workers would invariably cause class conflict. Why should those who are still lucky enough to have a job be taxed so heavily to support those who don't? And if most of their income ends up being confiscated for a UBI, what would then be the incentive to remain at work? The alternative, under the existing financial system, would be to fund a UBI by increasing the public debt. But this too has to be paid back, both principal and interest, via taxation. And that would put us more or less back in the same position as before. The diminishing working class would have to bear the brunt of the increasing debt servicing charges. The phenomenon of increasing technological unemployment, the fact that there won't be enough meaningful jobs to sustain a policy of full employment, thus explains why a UBI is needed. But it also explains why it cannot be financed by conventional means. This is a crucial point to which we'll return later on. That's not a very nice view,
up Star Alliance for your travels today. We hope that you've had a pleasant flight and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
After a long trip, we arrived safely in Toronto. Unfortunately, we were too jet-lagged to do any interviews. But after about a day or so, I asked the Australians what their impressions were of the country. It was the first time that either of them had been to Canada. All right, Michael. So, you've been in Canada now for, I think, almost 48 hours. What are your impressions of the country so far?
Well, Oliver, I think by the end of this trip, I won't want to leave the place.
That's not good, eh?
Yeah, yeah, gosh, yes. Yes, you know, even in the first 12 hours of being here, I'm already loved it. Just what do I say? The beautiful, enchanting landscape, the trees, the grass, your beautiful springtime. In this beautiful town of Ancaster, lovely people, beautiful architecture, marvelous atmosphere. I could live here, that's for sure.
While Canada is very beautiful during this time of the year, and it does enjoy certain privileges relative to other countries, it nevertheless suffers under the same monopolistic financial system which is in power the world over. Some of the problems that it creates were noticed by Chas during his stay over in Vancouver.
I think it's very beautiful and nice time of year. Michael didn't do this, but I spent a couple of days in Vancouver and there was quite a lot of poverty. Just sleeping in the street and probably drug-affected people. It was quite prevalent, much more than you'd see in Brisbane, for instance. So it seems like a very beautiful place that's had some poverty superimposed upon it.
I've asked Michael to interview me so that I could talk a little bit more about the problems which the current financial system creates for Canadians. This will also help us to cover some of the necessary ground before we can arrive at a true understanding of and appreciation for the social credit proposal for a national dividend.
So, Oliver, this is your family's home.
Yes, we're sitting outside my parents' place here in Ancaster. And this house was actually built in 1986, so it's a bit older than you are, Michael.
Gosh, yes, yeah.
Right? I've lived here for 32 years,
Mm.
and I've got a little secret to share
Oh, really now?
with the viewers, and that is that the mortgage on this house has not yet been paid in full.
Wow.
And
32 years,
32 years. That speaks to the fact that there's not enough, as we say in social credit, there's not enough purchasing power, not enough income being issued relative to prices to offset those prices in full and to liquidate all the costs of production. And one of the main ways of filling that gap is to get consumers to go into debt with the banks.
Yeah.
And whether we talk about a student loan or a car loan or a mortgage or a line of credit or installment purchases, all of these consumer buying plans involve borrowing new money into existence from the private banking system, because as we know, the banks do not lend other people's money, they create the money that they lend. One of the consequences of this over the past 15, 20 years in particular has been the constant increase in housing costs, housing prices, because they'll say that the prices have appreciated over time. That this house, for example, which was maybe $220,000 in 1986, is now closer to or above $1 million.
Wow.
This represents some sort of appreciation, but what in fact has happened is the banks have been in a position where they can lend more and more money to people to buy houses, and this causes the cost of housing, the house prices themselves, to be artificially inflated more and more and more as people, especially people with double incomes, are able to borrow more and more money from the banks to purchase homes. And one of the consequences of this, of course, is that none of the children that grew up in this house, myself or my two siblings, are in a position now to live here or in this neighborhood, because none of us could afford to buy a house costing upwards of $1 million or $1 million and higher. And because it's deemed to be so valuable, as far as the market is concerned, what the market will bear, property taxes have also increased, and my parents pay about $7,000
oh my goodness.
per year in property tax alone, and so that makes it very cost prohibitive as well.
Yeah.
And if we had a social credit system, we all had national dividends, and this gap was being filled regularly with debt-free credit, I think you'd find that housing prices would be a lot more reasonable.
Yes.
And the financial pressures that are put on people would be alleviated to a great extent, and that would mean that families would not be separated, forced to go to the four corners of the world in search of employment or in search of affordable housing.
Yes, that's right.
So contribute to greater social stability.
Yes, that's right. Because it's really tragic when you have your family, for example. You've grown up here. This is your life. This is where your formation took place.
That's right.
This is where you grew to become you, and obviously humans by nature need to, that they're attached to they're connected to their homes, their land, and their property. And,
That's right.
And the banks, by forcing you and your siblings basically out of your out of the home you grew up in, or the town you grew up in, it's forced displacement of human beings.
Yes, that's right. The forced displacement of human beings, and that, of course, is something that occurs not only on a local level or at the level of a state or province, or even at the level of a nation. It's occurring internationally, that people, largely because of artificial financial conditions, are uprooted from their countries of origin and forced to migrate thousands or even tens of thousands of kilometers from their countries of origin in order to try to make a better life for themselves financially elsewhere. And of course, countries are in constant need of growth as a way of maintaining financial equilibrium. And so there's an incentive on the part of countries that are doing better to constantly import newcomers as well in order to maintain the financial momentum of their societies. And all of these tendencies are completely artificial. It's nothing inherent to the nature of things. It's not some spontaneous or organic movement of the people.
No.
It's something which is which exists due to artificial financial causes, and if we could neutralize those causes, then we would necessarily neutralize the effects, and there would be greater social and cultural stability at all levels of society: local, state, provincial, national, and international.
Yes, absolutely.
And in other ways, that would also contribute to greater peace and stability in the world.
Yeah. So that will lead to less military conflict, less social and ethnic conflict, and greater stability and general happiness of populations and peoples and families.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So very beautifully said, Oliver.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
The opening event of the conference took place on the evening of Thursday, May 24th. It was a roundtable discussion entitled Basic Income, Meet the Pathfinders. As established politicians, or up-and-coming politicians, were overly represented on this panel, I think it best if we pass the whole thing over in silence. The official opening of the conference was the very next day. I asked Chas and Michael if they would share some of their pre-conference thoughts, feelings, and expectations.
Me, are you?
Yes, video time. So,
What do we think of this?
it's the first day of the conference, right? Friday, May 25th. And we're just about to go in for the first plenary session.
Nice sunny day.
It is a nice sunny day.
Not a cloud in the sky.
Not a cloud in the sky. Yes. So, any thoughts?
Well, we've got a very interesting, colourful lineup of speakers,
Yes.
which will no doubt be putting forward all manner of ideas and ideologies and views, and it will be really, today it will be really a matter of determining where they all stand
Right.
and how we can best approach them
Yes.
and advocate our position, which we believe is the most viable position to implement what we call the universal citizens dividend, what they call the basic income.
Chas, your words of wisdom.
I'm trying to give them up. Well, we'll just watch and observe today, and last night was very interesting. About half of what was said we concur with. About half was very confused and jumbled and just wrong-headed. But actually, in many respects, their attitudes were more hopeful than I would have thought, you know. They were
Right.
more in alignment with what we would think was the proper approach. So there's a bit of hope. You've really got to have a look at these people and see how they are. Well, at the end of the day, I'll tell you more about it.
Fair enough. Sounds good to me. Thank you.
As the conference begins, we are eager to get our message across, both formally in the presentations that we will be giving, but also informally in discussions with conference participants. We'll see if we can get some traction where the good news of social credit and its proposal of a national dividend are concerned.
I'm Sheila Rivera, for those of you who didn't see the show last night. I'm the chair of the Basic Income Canada Network, and I just want to welcome all of you here on behalf of everybody who's involved in the Planning Committee, BICN, US BIG, McMaster, and the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, and lots of other people who have been helping out.
On the second day of the conference, the day on which we were presenting, the fourth and final member of our panel arrived.
So Robert Klink is joining us from Gatineau, Quebec. Right, just arrived last evening.
A French-Canadian contingent.
That's right. Very good.
We also met up with Helen Camara, who was representing the Louis Evan Institute for Social Justice, otherwise known as the Pilgrims of St. Michael. She, too, will be giving a talk on social credit. So what exactly is this message that the five of us social creditors and national dividend proponents wish to communicate to the basic income community? I will now proceed to elaborate an answer to that question in far greater detail than has hitherto been possible, while interspersing segments from our various presentations as deemed appropriate. In a nutshell, the message is this: social credit and its proposal for a national dividend provide the perfect answer to the dilemma posed by increasing technological unemployment. You will recall the general nature of the dilemma in question. On the one hand, we will need a universal basic income because the people being thrown out of work on a more or less permanent basis will need to retain access to goods and services so that they can survive. On the other hand, as the pool of the employed shrinks, it will be more and more difficult, if not impossible, to finance a UBI through conventional financial means. Even now it seems like a stretch.
So, can Ontario afford a basic income for all its population, a universal and unconditional benefit? If $1,500 per month was issued to each person in Ontario, the cost to the government would be $250 billion. If that amount was issued to each Canadian, the cost would be astronomical. Even with offset savings that we've been hearing about all weekend, gleaned from collapsing the social assistance programs with a more easily administered program, can we afford to borrow more money, increase Ontario's debt, and raise taxes? Economic growth indicators in Ontario and Canada are not promising, even though we are told the economy is doing well. The stock market seems to be doing all right, but the real economy is not. Investment is collapsing. There's a declining workforce participation rate. There's more homelessness, more food banks, fewer jobs, and more children living in poverty than ever before. People are working more and more hours to make ends meet, and minimum wage hikes have not managed to solve the problem of poverty over the years.
So we have a choice. We can provide a UBI until the working segment of the population rebels or becomes incapable of sustaining the program, or we can refuse to implement a UBI and allow the technologically unemployed to turn to begging, to crime, or to mass revolution. Not a very nice set of options. But there is a way of sidestepping this dilemma, and this is where monetary reform in general and social credit in particular come into the picture. What if it were possible to finance something like a basic income through fresh money creation that is issued free of debt as opposed to the standard recipe of taxation and/or increased debt? The direct payment of debt-free credit to the consumer was referred to by C.H. Douglas as a national dividend, and it bears certain remarkable similarities to a basic income. It would be a periodic, say monthly or bi-weekly payment, made to each citizen of a country, regardless of employment status. Under modern industrial conditions, it was anticipated that such a payment would at least be sufficient to meet one's basic needs for food, clothing, shelter, and so forth. The good news about the prospect of a dividend of this type, a dividend financed through monetary reform, is that it shows that it is not at all necessary to provide a basic income by means of redistributive taxation, that is, by robbing Peter to pay Paul, or by means of increasing government debts. Just over 100 years ago, the founder of the social credit movement, Major C.H. Douglas, began to present to the world his diagnosis of what was wrong with the financial system and what could be done to fix it. Douglas was an accomplished engineer and looked at the mechanism of finance from an engineering point of view. His core claim was that the financial system was dysfunctional because it did not automatically provide the consumer with sufficient purchasing power to offset the costs of production. There was a structural imbalance between the flow of costs and prices on the one hand, and the flow of incomes in the form of wages, salaries, and dividends to consumers on the other. We, as a community, are not paid sufficiently to purchase in full whatever we produce. It is as if for every $100 in value that we produce, we are only given $50 in income with which that $100 can be bought. Now, Douglas postulated several causes to account for the gap. What is interesting about Douglas's analysis for our purposes is this. The tendency to replace labor with machinery or real capital an intensifying tendency as we have seen, is actually the chief cause of the deficiency of consumer income relative to the flow of prices of consumer goods and services. Let us imagine two compartments that are sealed off by a penetrable wall. On the one side, we have the producer's market representing all the transactions undertaken by producers in the chain of production. And, on the other side, we have the consumers obtaining incomes from their ownership over the various factors of production, including labor, and spending that income in the acquisition of consumers' goods and services. Let us also note the following. Firstly, in the formal economy, production requires money in order for it to occur. Secondly, under the existing financial rules and practice, 95% or more of the money supply is created in the form of credit by private banks whenever they make a loan or purchase. This money is destroyed when the loan is repaid or the bank purchase is sold to the public. Thirdly, all costs must be recovered in prices. The basic problem is this. The money that is put into production, whether obtained from a bank or another source, is not trickling out to consumers in the form of incomes as fast as it is being put in. But all money expended by a business must ultimately be recovered from consumers in prices in order that their production loans can be repaid or their working capital can be restored. The result is that the flow of production costs, what businesses are obliged to recover from consumers, exceeds the flow of incomes within the same cycles of production. The financial system is not self-liquidating. So where does the money go that is being poured into production at all stages, but is not being released to consumers in the form of income? Well, some of it falls into sinks, in which it disappears, and some of it falls into pools, in which it is sequestered for a certain period of time. The sinks represent capital loan repayments or capex charges, and the pools represent charges for the operation of real capital, such as depreciation and maintenance charges. You see, it is mainly on account of real capital, machines and equipment, that businesses are obliged to recover more money in the prices of what is eventually sold to the consuming public than they have simultaneously distributed to the consuming public in incomes. As capital continues to replace labor as technology advances, capital costs must occupy a greater and greater proportion of total costs relative to labor costs. Thus, the phenomenon which is throwing people out of work is also responsible for an increasing deficiency of consumer buying power relative to prices. We will return to this astounding fact shortly, as resolving the matter along social credit lines is the key to cutting the Gordian knot posed by increasing technological unemployment. In the meantime, I want to emphasize that the fact of the gap is by no means some theoretical abstraction. It is empirically demonstrable using government statistics. Citing U.S. government statistics for the year 2014, Chas Pinwell has estimated that only $10.1 trillion in personal income had been distributed over and against $12.5 trillion in consumer goods and services, and a total of $17.39 trillion in GDP. This left a gap of $2.4 trillion and $7.3 trillion, respectively. A copy of his document, entitled A National Supply and Demand Account from the Perspective of Proper Persons for the United States of America in 2014, was published in my 2017 book, Lives of Our Own.
You'll be pleased to hear that the first national profit and loss account in the world has been put together, and it's been published in this book by the previous speaker, Oliver, and it runs to several pages, got all the data. It was done by Australians for the US economy, with US statistics obviously, so all the data is all there. And you can also get access to those national accounts that have been done, they're specific, from that links on my card. Now what do they show? They show that if you add up the income of every American, every single American from every source, wages and salaries, come to about 42.5% of GDP. Total wages and salaries and benefits from employers come to 42.5%. If you add in dividends and interest and proprietal, like private company profits and things like that, you get to 58%. You got 58 cents to buy every dollar's worth of production, and it all has to be paid ultimately by consumers. The capital costs don't have to be paid now, but they do have to be paid later when those capital costs are added into prices. So, the total income of all United States citizens was $10.1 trillion. The GDP was $17.3 trillion. But this is the interesting thing. The consumer products actually produced by Americans and sold was $12.5 trillion. So they bought with $12.5 trillion, but their income was only 10.1. How can they do that? There was no dividend issued because that's really a profit, but it's also a shortage of purchasing power that generates for technical reasons. And I could explain them to them, but I'm not going to. Pursue it if you like, and I'd encourage you to. But irrespective of why that occurs, it does occur. This profit, this deficiency of purchasing power is there. We know it's there because it is measurable. If you measure a crocodile, I'll tell you, you can be assured the damn thing exists. And we measured this thing, it's measured, it's provable, it's proven, and it's unarguable. And if you divide up the profit that's been there, it's measured and proven, it comes to $7,500 per every American. And for families of four, that's $30,000. And I'll tell you, I'll guarantee you that is underestimated. Seriously underestimated. Every time we got a choice to make the gap or the profit look less, we took that one. For instance, they tried to tell us in their statistics that the dividend income, personal dividend income of Americans was over $800 billion. We looked at just that of Standard & Poor's companies, looked at every one, how many shares are actually owned by proper persons rather than corporations. We found out it was only 2.5%. And yet half of the dividends paid in America are paid by Standard & Poor companies. So all we did to make sure, we said, look, we're going to halve that, we're going to accept 400 billion. But we know that's hundreds of billions overestimating the income going to proper persons in America. So we're quite confident that it's very significant. It may be, if the figures were done properly, if you just distribute that dividend, it may be pretty much a full basic income to the extent that we'd like it.
More recently, the May 2018 Financial Fact Sheet, published by the province of Ontario, indicated that total GDP of the province was $830,302 million, while total personal income was only $547,633 million. In per capita terms, that equates to $58,499 in GDP versus $38,584 in income, or a total gap of nearly $20,000 per capita. The real underlying gap between the flow of prices and the flow of incomes is even larger than these statistics indicate, because the existing financial system employs a number of palliatives in the attempt to at least cover the gap between the rate of flow of consumer prices and the rate of flow of incomes. Chief amongst these palliatives is the borrowing of more and more debt money into existence from the private banks in order to buoy up the flow of consumer buying power. Some of that money is used to initiate new production or to extend existing production facilities. The income from that production, especially capital production, will filter through to consumers in the present as incomes, while the costs of that production may not filter through for months, years, or even decades in prices or taxes. But there is also the new money that is being lent directly to consumers. Do you ever stop to wonder why so many people are heavily indebted, whether it be with a mortgage, car loan, student loan, credit card debts, lines of credit, etc.? It is because we are not provided with sufficient income to meet the costs of goods at remunerative prices. So we borrow to make up the difference. This is why there is over $2 trillion outstanding in consumer loans in Canada, and the average Canadian owes $1.70 for every dollar he receives per year in disposable income. Those numbers only tend to get worse over time. So this is how the gap is filled and equilibrium achieved under the existing financial system. New bank credit is created and issued that is unrelated to the production cycles of the goods and services that are being bought, in order to supplement the public's buying power. When too little compensatory debt money is issued to fill the gap, the economy suffers from a recession or worse. Businesses subsidize the consumer with discounted sales as a prelude to going out of business. Unemployment rises, and a general economic misery ensues. And when, in a period of economic boom, too much debt money is issued, and the money in consumer pockets overshoots the gap, we have demand-pull inflation. Borrowing new money into existence can fill the gap temporarily and imperfectly, but it also has its problems. It means, first off, that the whole economy must steadily increase its outstanding debt to the banks, with all the interest charges that involves, because it cannot afford to pay its way in full otherwise. This leads to a massive and exponentially increasing societal debt burden, which, when it can no longer be sustained, occasions a financial crisis.
Already, Ontario is the most indebted subnational jurisdiction in North America. We've been hearing these numbers all weekend. Canadians had the dubious distinction of being the most indebted on the planet in the last quarter of 2017, with a debt-to-income ratio of 171%. Every day in Canada, $50 million is added to the debt. The U.S. federal debt has more than doubled in the last 10 years, increasing from $9.4 trillion to $21 trillion, and credit card debt in the U.S. is almost at $1 trillion. And yet we have this situation where stores are full, there's no shortage of goods, low interest rates keep us borrowing, and credit is almost boundless, keeping the economy afloat. However, without massive borrowing to fill that gap of $251 billion, the shortfall in the Ontario economy, or with the inevitable increase in interest rates, we would see significant social hardship in Ontario.
The Institute of International Finance has calculated total global debt at the end of 2016 to be $217 trillion, having risen by something approaching a quarter of this sum over just the previous decade. Even more shocking than these numbers is the fact that this aggregate debt is more than 3 times globally aggregated GDPs. Think about that. While some analysts downplay the significance of such numbers, the plain fact is there is an immense lien incumbent against future human endeavors. Repayment of principal and carrying charges will be withdrawn from future revenues of the members of society, either directly by financial institutions or via taxes collected by governments and prices set by corporations.
In the second place, reliance on ever-increasing debt to fill the gap is also inflationary. This is easiest to grasp in the case of consumer debt, but the general explanation for why consumer debt is inflationary is just as applicable to compensatory debt involving private or public production. When people have borrowed credit from the banks, their future incomes will be burdened with debt servicing charges. This erodes their buying power. In order to maintain the standard of living, demands will be made for increases in wages and salaries. But since wages and salaries all go into costs, any increase in them will generally drive prices up. This in turn feeds the demand for even more credit in a never-ending wage cost spiral. It is on account of this type of cost-push inflation that currencies like the US dollar have lost 95% of their value in the last 100 years. Indeed, the prescription of ever more debt to manage the increasing price-income gap is also heavily implicated, either as a direct cause or as an exacerbating factor, in a large number of economic, social, cultural, environmental, and political problems. The need to borrow more and more money at a faster rate than any of it can be paid back drives a policy of forced economic growth. The economy, like a cancer, must grow and grow and grow some more as the condition of the possibility of maintaining financial equilibrium between consumer prices and consumer incomes. New markets must be found and new needs invented and sold through advertising. The result is that many things are produced in today's economy that would not be desired by the fully enfranchised or properly financed consumer. Economic inefficiency, waste, and sabotage abound and can assume many forms, such as built-in obsolescence. One of the worst examples of waste is the policy of seeking to export more than you import, also referred to as a favorable balance of trade. In this case, a country seeks to export, not for the sake of needed imports, but for the sake of obtaining more money to compensate for the lack of consumer buying power in the domestic economy. This turns international trade into a desperate scramble amongst competing nations for an artificially scarce flow of consumer incomes, instead of it being a balanced, complementary, and mutually beneficial trade in goods for goods. Such a perennial state of war in international trade is a form of economic conflict that has often led to real or military wars to achieve by force what could not be achieved by market competition. The irony here is that war itself is a very useful method for filling the gap, as the production will never be sold domestically to consumers, but will instead be exported to the enemy. It thus increases the flow of incomes in the economy, while not adding to the flow of goods and services. Historically, wars have often been used to refloat the economy, to get it out of a recession or a depression. Other problems caused by the debt money system and its faulty methods for filling the price-income gap include heavy and often increasing taxation, the usurpation of the unearned increment of association by the private banking system, the centralization of economic wealth, privilege, and power in fewer and fewer hands, social conflict, forced migration, cultural dislocation, and environmental degradation, and the list goes on and on. But perhaps the two most serious problems created by the existing financial system that should be of interest to basic income supporters are 1. Poverty in the midst of plenty, and 2. Servility in place of freedom. Poverty in any modern industrialized state is never due to a scarcity in real goods and services, either real or potential. We have the physical resources necessary to meet everyone's needs. Poverty is a purely financial phenomenon. It exists because the poor lack sufficient buying power. That's all there is to it. As far as servility is concerned, we are also physically capable of providing everyone with what they need to survive and to flourish, while only calling on a small proportion of the available labor force. And yet, because work remains as the generally necessary condition for obtaining an income under the existing economic system, we insist on a physically inefficient and unnecessary policy of full employment, when we should actually be enjoying increased leisure as machines do more and more of the work. The result is that a large number of existing jobs are useless, witless, redundant, and/or destructive. They only exist because we have to find some way of distributing additional income to consumers.
Work is just when it is undertaken freely and by consent of the individual, and is not imposed or unjustly demanded by a dysfunctional or corrupt financial or economic system, when that perhaps that work is not necessary, or that amount of work is not necessary to supply all society all the goods and services that it requires. This reigning economic model hollows out culture, blockades and shatters family life, and suppresses the creative impulse which is vital for the cultivation of the arts and philosophy. When people are threatened with the possibility or reality of economic insecurity and poverty, they are under tremendous physical and mental stress. That can result in health problems, criminal behaviour, greed, and unscrupulous competition. Since leisure forms the basis of culture, which is essentially the spiritual expression of the soul of a people, the resulting suppression of leisure by the dysfunctional servile worker economy results in the degeneration and stifling of true art and culture in favour of lesser and more base forms. Such a system is profoundly inimical towards the kinds of people who possess great talents, skills, temperaments for the arts, innovation, philosophy and intellectual spheres due to their being economically and socially disenfranchised. They are either forced to take up servile employment instead or face destitution.
But you see, there is no need for any of this dysfunction. According to the proposals presented in the interwar years, so between the First World War and the Second World War, by the founder of the social credit movement, Major C.H. Douglas, the most effective, efficient, and just method of returning the financial system to a position of self-liquidation, wherein these massive debts are not allowed to pile up, would be to A, break the private bank's monopoly on money creation and issuance, by B, establishing a national credit authority, an organ of the state, to calculate the volume of debt-free credit that is needed to balance incomes with prices, and to distribute that credit directly to or on behalf of the consumer. This would allow the producer to recover all the costs of production with a fresh flow of adequate cost-liquidating income, leaving no residual debt behind, and hence contributing nothing to an ever-increasing mountain of societal debt, while ensuring the full and easy distribution of goods and services to consumers. Douglas's proposal for reforming the financial system was to issue sufficient debt-free credit to fill the recurring price-income gap in lieu of all of the compensatory debt and other palliatives presently employed by the current system. The unmet costs in the price structure would be monetized by the creation of this debt-free credit. the effective distribution of the economy's consumer production would then be assured by the issuance of this credit to, or on behalf of, consumers. Filling the gap in this way would return the financial system to a position of an automatic, self-liquidating equilibrium, in which the flow of costs and hence prices on the one hand, and the flow of consumer buying power on the other, would always be maintained in a perfect balance. A national credit office, an organ of the state, independent of political interference, would be tasked with responsibility of calculating the volume of debt-free credit that is necessary, in each economic period, to effect the desired equation. It would also create the credit in question and inject it into the economy. Part of the debt-free credit was to be issued in the form of a compensated price discount on all retail goods in accordance with the economy's ratio of consumption to production. Retailers would lower prices to the consumer and be reimbursed by the National Credit Authority for their out-of-pocket expenses. This would ensure that all consumer goods and services are sold at a price that corresponds to the real costs of their production. At present, these prices are artificially inflated due to the presence of capital loan charges in production, the sinks that we mentioned earlier. The rest of the credit necessary to balance the economy, which would offset the unprovided for OPEX or operating charges of real capital, would be distributed directly to consumers as a national dividend. Like a UBI, the national dividend would be an unconditional periodic payment made to each citizen. Considering the productivity of the modern industrial economy, such payments should be enough to at least cover the basic costs of living. Since both the bulk of the price-income gap as well as the phenomenon of technological unemployment are caused by the intensifying tendency of real capital to replace labor in production, issuing a national dividend to cover part of that gap actually kills two birds with one stone. On the one hand, it provides an income to all those who will be thrown out of work or who are unable to work or who choose not to work. In doing so, it would eliminate poverty and the fear of poverty. On the other hand, and this is its key advantage over a UBI, a national dividend also provides a reliable source of funding for that income that completely sidesteps the problems posed by taxing and/or indebting the diminishing working classes along conventional financial lines. And just like that, the Gordian knot posed by increasing technological unemployment is undone. Naturally, by helping to fill the gap, the national dividend would also help to eliminate, or at least attenuate, all of the other economic, social, environmental, and political problems that were mentioned earlier in conjunction with the debt money system.
It's important to recognize the change in the social environment in all areas of human relations and endeavor that such a policy would affect. Knowing that you have a dependable source of income relieves the kind of destructive stress that manifests as psychological harm and disease. The edge would be taken off the desperate, often virtually life or death aspect of competition for income providing positions. Knowing that you have an economic backstop liberates you from participating in economic activity that you judge to be unethical or otherwise harmful. Having confidence that you will always have the monetary means of survival removes a common motive to commit crimes, including committing suicides, which always go up in times of economic distress. Because a failure in productive efficiency would automatically be reflected in reduced dividend payments, there would be a constant societal incentive to accomplish projects in the soundest, most durable, and least cumbersome manner possible. In other words, we put an emphasis on efficiency rather than on artificial make-work projects. Since people who have economic clout learn quickly how to exercise it, governments would have to heed the wishes of the economically enfranchised population rather than circumvent them under pressure from corporate and political lobbyists. People would be able to work for causes in which they believed without fear of consequently suffering punishment in the form of financial ruin. Social harmony would be favored and divisive identity politics obviated. Importantly, the economic pressure that frequently results in war would be relieved. It looks as if we're heading that way right now with this trade competition that's being developed. There would be considerably less waste of human life and fuel sitting in traffic in order to get to make work employment. I had the experience of that yesterday when I drove through Toronto and over to Hamilton and spent 3 hours in traffic. Is this the best we can do? Is this why have we created this situation? It's madness.
Please note that the social credit monetary reform does not require nationalization of the banking system, collective ownership of the means of production, price fixing, excessive government interference in the economy, heavy taxation, or any other classically socialist methods. However, there are two common objections to the national dividend that have often been raised. One is that it would be inflationary, and two, that it would be unsustainable if, say, too many people decided not to work and to live off of their dividends alone. The response to the first objection is that the national dividend, like all of the compensatory debt-free credit in the social credit system, is only issued to the extent that the price-income gap requires it, and it is also issued in place of all of the compensatory debt money that is currently being injected to fill the gap. When the debt-free credit is received by retailers in exchange for their goods, the money will be used to pay down revolving lines of bank credit and will thus be destroyed, or it will be used to restore working capital and will only be reissued alongside a new series of costs. There is therefore no danger that the money would pile up and lead to inflation. The response to the second objection is that the dividend is indexed to productivity, and its size therefore depends on how many goods need to be distributed. If too many people opt to leave the labor force, production will decline, and so will the dividend. This decrease in purchasing power thus serves as a natural feedback loop, indicating the need for more labor if the desired standard of living is to be secured. A third objection that we might mention, and this is something that has been raised against both the UBI and social credit, is that these sorts of ideas are utopian. As far as social credit is concerned, we are not aiming at a mathematically perfect world. What we're aiming to do instead is to arrive at a healthy world, a world which approaches optimal functioning, insofar as it is within our human power to influence the matter.
Social credit does not claim to create a utopian society, but it does seek to provide the opportunity to individuals to forge their own utopias. As Douglas says in his address, International Finance, quote, "What we really demand of existence is not that we shall be put into somebody else's utopia, but we shall be put in a position to construct a utopia of our own." Close quote.
So what are the next steps towards making a national dividend, based on a social credit financial system, a reality? I'll let Chas Pinwell field this question.
All we have to do to break this thing where we can't get basic income is get governments to do bloody national accounts. Do a balance sheet. Do a profit and loss account. And if they do, it'll be undeniable that the profit is there. They will not be able to keep you in poverty, because when the profit is there, the only question left is, who does it belong to? Now at the moment, it belongs to those who monopolise credit.
There is also a question that needs to be posed to the wider basic income community. All of the problems that we've been discussing that are associated with the current debt money system, as well as the necessity for monetary reform and proposals like social credit's national dividend, all appear to be like the proverbial elephant in the living room. They're not on the radar at all. Why is that?
What surprises me is how little discussion there is in the universal basic income movement of non-taxation based approaches to how we can distribute the UBI. I'm very glad that this panel happened today. It was the only other speakers that I heard here at this whole event other than me that talked about a monetary policy approach. So thank you all for doing that. What I want to ask you is, why do you think that is? That the monetary policy approaches are still so little discussed, and when they seem to, at least to me, to be really more the common sense way to do it, because it would produce a lot less opposition in society, like from taxpayers, for example. So if you could address that, is it just an educational issue that just people don't even know how money gets created, or what do you think is the problem?
It's educational, but it's also power politics. You see, if you've got the right to create and loan more money than you've got, the creators of credit were more or less forced to take control of the media. It began with goldsmiths who had a certain amount of gold, but they created more notes than they had gold, and they loaned out more credit than they had notes. So the whole thing was built on credit. That's why we call finance credit. And if the opposition bank owned the newspaper, say in the 1900s, and put out in the room that you're probably going to go belly up, you'd go belly up. They had to control the media. It wasn't a matter of, well, will we or won't they? If they didn't, they went down to the opposition. So what you've got is a situation where money, the right to create money, has bought the right to sing the narrative. The repertoire of what is publicly sung is wholly in their hands. We have managed to convince the world that banks create credit, but we've had no help at all from the established media. 6 companies own 98% of the media in the USA, and you won't find them talking about banks creating credit. And you certainly won't find them talking about modern industrial computerised society being increasingly profitable. That just won't happen. They don't want us educated in this area because they've got tremendous sanctions. All I want to say about this is people act in their own self-interest. Don't let them tell you they're talking about conspiracy. Everybody, if they've got any brains, acts in their own self-interest. They do try to temper that with compassion and thoughtfulness for others, but when you get down at that sort of level, they're frightened of a world. What are we going to do if we're free? What are we going to do? Well, we'll probably, make love, not war, for a start. We'll probably reconstitute things completely. We'll write them out of all their privileges. So it's very hard. Look, Aldous Huxley was good on this, and I looked at his research recently. He says 20% of people are extremely vulnerable to suggestion. If you control the narrative and what they're being told, no matter what it is, 20% will believe it. 20% will be so sceptical about it, you'll never convince them, and the rest are in the middle. So, they've always got about 50%. If you own the Sun narrative, you've got about 50% on side. You've got the 20% that you can tell them anything and they'll believe it. If you tell them, reliably. Now, Richard Nixon, it's a bit different now, but Richard Nixon said that the American people will never believe anything that they haven't seen on television. And at that stage, it was pretty close to it. We're getting an alternative media going. mean, very slowly. A tentative meeting is going to have. We're going to have to build this media slowly, where we inform each other, and we leave them out of it. And we've got to get hold of the. Well, I won't tell you another story, but I won't.
This documentary was sponsored by the Clifford Hugh Douglas Institute for the Study and Promotion of Social Credit, socred.org, and by Social Credit Australia, socialcredit.com.au. All of the social credit papers that were presented in the course of the 2018 NABIG conference are also available to be read on the NABIG website. We've got all these cars here in the parking lot at the GO train station, and what would you like to say about that, Mikey?
Well, Oliver, you see all those cars. This is Monday.
Today's Monday.
That's right.
And all these people are parking their car there because they use the GO train to commute into Toronto and other areas for work.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Now, can you imagine how much time, how much money that costs them to do that?
Yes.
When they could be making far better use of their time at home or elsewhere, other than just sitting on trains and in cars for the significant chunk of the day, and then as well going and sitting in an office or working in a factory or whatever, whichever sort of job they go to.
Yes.
Now, if we had a dividend, if everyone had a dividend, and because there's less and less of a need for people to be working now, thanks to technological automation that is doing more and more of the work instead of us humans. A dividend, if you had a free dividend, you would not need to go to work, or wouldn't need to go to work as much. And thus you would not have to undergo this very boring, mundane, perhaps stressful and very time-wasting exercise of commuting to and from work, whichever by train or by car. So that would free up so much time for people so that they could go and be doing much more constructive and more creative things.